Every new year needs a new product. Let's make one together. Hi, I'm Ken from KHK Woodworks. Today, in part 2 of our two-part series, I'll show you all the steps necessary to create our shaker-inspired divided carrier using the tooling that we created in part 1. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go check it out. Go ahead. I'll wait. Learning to read wood's grain will dramatically improve your woodworking. You can see how the grain runs out of the face of this board at a sharp angle. To minimize chip out, move the workpiece on the machine so that the rotary cutter is in the same direction. Moving in the opposite direction will cause the cutter to lift the fibers along that sharp angle, making it chip out. An arrow marked on the face keeps me cutting consistent for all machining operations. Whether I'm flattening the workpiece on the joiner or resawing on the bandsaw. Whenever you resaw, the important thing is keeping the workpiece flat to the fence. The drum sander makes quick work of removing any marks from resawing and makes the pieces a consistent thickness. Here's a tip I've mentioned before, but it's really worth repeating. Painter's tape is a great resource for ganging multiple pieces together, speeding production. If you also put tape along a cut line, it'll prevent chipping out as you cut the thin pieces. Using the new finger jig that we created in the last episode, use a mechanical pencil to trace the outline and mark the tack positions. A slight depression using an awl will prevent the drill from wandering off location. Here you can see how the painter's tape keeps the cut line crisp and chip out free. Retracting the bit periodically during drilling helps break the chips and keeps the bit clear and prevents splitting the thin bands. Rough cut the fingers using a bandsaw or a coping saw if you only have hand tools. On my larger boxes and carriers, I glue up the bottom pieces from narrower stock. This actually makes the pieces more stable and less prone to cupping over time. I lay the boards side by side until I find a grain pattern that matches and that's most visually appealing. Here's another tip. Put the faces together of the boards that you plan to edge glue when you run them through the joiner. Even if your joiner fence isn't exactly 90 degrees to the bed, your pieces will still glue together perfectly flat. Don't believe me? Google complementary angles theorem. Geometry rocks. This works so well most of the times, I don't even need clamps when doing the glue up. Painter's tape is elastic enough so that you can stretch it before pressing it down, and it acts like a clamp. Just make sure you apply tape to both faces using equal pressure. After sufficient drying time, a sharp scraper does a great job of removing any hardened glue squeeze out. A sharp utility knife is the best tool to fine-tune fingers to their final shape. This allows you to slightly taper the edges, about 10 degrees, and makes a graceful, continuous curve. Here you can see a good example of what the final taper looks like. Both ends of the bands are sanded to a taper so that there's less of a step where they overlap. Without this step, the overlap would be fully double thickness of the material. Finally, now we're ready for my favorite part, bending. It's always fascinating to me that heat can alter the properties of wood such that you can easily bend it to a desired shape. Symmetry and proportion are fundamental to shaker design. Lining up the center tack line on the minor axis of the bending form, make sure that the overlap of the fingers and the tail ends are equal. Make sure you hold both fingers when you're taking the bands off the form to prevent splitting at the sharp point between the fingers. A small scrap of wood and a spring clamp frees up your hands for the tacking. Hammering the copper tacks against a galvanized pipe anvil bends over the tack points on the backside, clinching them so they won't pull out. Align the plywood drying forms that we also created in the last episode to hold the band shape while they dry overnight. Dryers themselves don't have to be wedged in very tight. In fact, if they're too tight, it will cause the band's sides to flare out as they shrink when they're drying. Next, we'll use a handle jig that we made in the last episode. First, trace the handle shape so we can rough cut the shape on the bandsaw just proud of the line. A couple of holes drilled in the handle opening and connecting them with a jigsaw prepares the rough shape of the handle hold. Then it's back to the handle jig using a flush trimming bit in your router to create the final shape. Shallow dado in the tray bottom keeps the handle centered during the final assembly and makes for a clean and strong glue joint. The bottom dado also makes it easy to align the band accurately so that you're disposing symmetrically while the band outline is traced using a mechanical pencil. A thin scrap piece put across the bands distributes the pressure evenly, keeping the band flat to the board bottom. Cut proud of the line on the bandsaw. Then sand to the line on a disc sander tilted to a -2° angle. This makes the bottom fit like a cork for a nice, snug fit. Here you can see how tapering the band ends minimizes the step in the overlap at the ends of the bands that we talked about earlier. The bottom should not fit too tight when fitting to the band, or wedging it could pop the copper tacks. Having about half the thickness of the bottom engaged before pressing the band down completely should give you the right amount of tension. For smaller boxes, I drill 8 equally spaced holes around for the wooden pegs. For this size and larger, I space them about every 2 inches along the circumference. A simple cardboard template keeps the spacing even and consistent. Custom engineered wooden dowels, also known as toothpicks, are all that's needed to attach the bottom. No glue is needed, friction fit is good enough. Each peg is clipped using diagonal cutters and then trimmed flush using a sharp utility knife. Now's a good time to finish sand the outside surfaces first with a hand sander, then touch up any sharp edges and recesses where the sanders can't reach by hand. Fitting the handle is done by extending the dado edges up to the top, then centering the handle along the top edge. Mark the length on both sides. Then trim on a miter saw as many times as required to sneak up on a tight fit. A little glue in the dado and along the bottom of the handle will keep it secure. After it dries, you can drill and peg the sides similar to how the bottoms are attached, also using toothpicks. Finally, a whole lot of sanding down to 220 grit finish, 4 coats of a hand-rubbed marine finish, sanded to 320 grit between each coat, and a final hand-rubbed paste wax finish, and you end up with a elegantly simple, extremely useful, and beautiful product that anyone will love. You may want to plan on building more than one of these because they will be the object of affection and coveted by any neighbors, family members, or friends that come to visit and see these on your countertop. So enjoy this project. It was really great to build. It's something extremely useful, and I'm really happy with the final result. As always, thanks for watching. Wait, before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any new videos, and then give the video a thumbs up with the like button below to show the community what you think. Now go make something great. You know you can do it.